for now, I will very briefly introduce Mike, whose brief CV has come through our notices about the program. I will say that he and I first knew one another when he was serving as the executive director of the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust. He left profitable law firm to join the nonprofit world and has contributed in many other nonprofits in the area, to include chairing the board of the beloved Arlington Outdoor Lab facility, the C&O Canal Trust, the Montgomery Parks Foundation, as well as the Nova Parks Board of Directors. So Mike has been a leader in all of these fields, and we're deeply grateful to him and to his communications assistant, Renee Barassa, who also joins us this evening, for giving us their time and their expertise to talk about the water quality issues that face us in our very important Potomac River Basin. So Mike, please take it away.
No, well, thank you. And I will preface by saying that I'm currently the executive director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, and that we're sharing all this information with you, and hope you find it interesting. So as you received an email that went through all the things I plan to cover tonight, we'll see how many I get to. The picture you see on the right there is I'm at the Fairfax Stone, which is a small park in West Virginia, and is the traditional source of the Potomac River. So I wanted to start at the source, so to speak, but I want to put the Potomac River into a little bit of a context. Next slide, Renee. So here you see the Chesapeake Bay watershed on the left-hand side. It goes all the way from Cooperstown, New York, all the way down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and then the Potomac River Basin is shown in blue there, and then blowing that. So the Potomac River Basin is provides about 25% of the fresh water to the Chesapeake Bay. The Susquehanna provides about 50%, and the rest of the James and the other rivers. So as far as the watershed goes, about 11% of the watershed is in Pennsylvania, 39% is in Virginia, 26% is in Maryland, 23% is in West Virginia, and 1% is in the District of Columbia. So on the right-hand side, you see a detail of all of the tributaries of the Potomac River. And you see the main ones there in Maryland. You have the Monocacy and the Conococheque. In Virginia, of course, you have the Shenandoah. And there are other ones, including the Anacostia in the District of Columbia. But you'll see on the left-hand side of that map, there's the North Branch of the Potomac, and then below that, the South Branch of the Potomac. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. So, so what's the source of the Potomac? As I mentioned, the traditional source is the Fairfax Stone, and that is because in 1632 there was a grant from the king to Lord Calvert, who was also known as the Baron of Baltimore, for the land lieth under the 40th degree of north latitude, which is the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, to the Potomac River, but the grant said unto the further bank of said river. So therefore, the dividing line between the river, the states along the river, is not the middle of the river, but rather the further bank, which is the south bank of the Potomac River. That's the boundary line. So Maryland owns the Potomac River, and that has been a source of contention for a long time between Maryland and Virginia. The Supreme Court determined that, well, it's also a little bit more refined than that. It's the low water mark on the south bank of the Potomac River that's actually the boundary. And that is because Virginia had certain prescription rights, and so therefore it was the the boundary was going to be the low water mark there. So now you had this grant to Lord Calvert, but you also had another grant, and that was to Lord Fairfax. Well, Lord Fairfax inherited it. So now that set up a competition between the two states. Now, the western boundary of Maryland was set at a vertical line from the 40 degrees north latitude southward to what was called the first fountain of the River Potomac, which is the source of the Potomac. Now, the grant to Lord Fairfax also had a corner of it that was touching what they called the first fountain of the Potomac. So it was important to identify where the first fountain was to determine the boundary between these two grants, one to Lord Calvert or the Baron of Baltimore, and the other one to Lord Fairfax. So Virginians being on the ball, they set out a survey party to go upstream to try to find the source of the Potomac. And that was 1736. So near Old Town, Maryland, there was a choice to make between the north branch of the Potomac and the south branch of the Potomac. So the surveyors chose to continue along what we now call the north branch instead of going left along the south branch. And they set a stone there, and they called that the Fairfax Stone to mark the source. So the important thing to remember here is that the south branch source is near what they call Hightown, Virginia. And normally, surveyors would follow the higher flow. Normally, the south branch of the Potomac has a higher flow than the north branch. Now, it could have been in 1736 that the rainfall in the southern branch of the Potomac got more water, and so therefore the flow was higher, and so therefore they were going to, or the north branch had a higher flow, so they were going to follow the north branch. Now, for example, in 1969, the south branch did have a lower average flow than the north branch, so that could have been the case. I speculate that maybe they just wanted to push the boundary of Maryland as far north as possible so that they would have as much land in Virginia as possible. So that's a matter of speculation. So here in the map on the right-hand side shows what would have happened if the south branch of the Potomac was the boundary line between the two states. And you see on the top there, that little triangle, that's where it is today. And so Maryland would have been much larger if they had followed the south branch. Now, Maryland finally got its act together and said, well, wait a second here. No Maryland people were on this survey party. And we think that actually it's not that little stream that you identified called the source of the Potomac, but rather what we call the Potomac Spring, which is actually further west. And so they went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and said that their source would have been better, and that would have moved the line about a mile west. Now, the Supreme Court said to Maryland that you probably have the better argument, that the Fairfax Stone is not the place. It's really the Potomac Stone, which is where Maryland put it. And so they argued about that for a while. And the Supreme Court said, well, you're probably right, Maryland, but all the land records and all the people have accepted the Fairfax Stone as the boundary. So therefore you lose because, it would be too upsetting for the entire region if we move the boundary now. So therefore the Fairfax Stone was where they agreed it should be. So a little bit of history there. Next slide. So Potomac River Basin facts, 14,670 square miles, about the size of Switzerland, 383 miles from the Fairfax Stone to Point Lookout in Maryland. And these are 50% forested, 25% agriculture, 15% developed, and 10% other. The highest flow was 275 billion, that's a billion with a B, gallons per day in March 1936. The lowest flow was 388 million gallons per day in September of 1966. The average flow is about 7 billion gallons per day, which is almost 11,000 Olympic swimming pools per day that flow downstream. But I'll talk more about that September 1966 a little later. There's some pictures there, Harper's Ferry being under the floodwaters in 1936. If you go to Harper's Ferry, you can see the marks on the building of 1936. And then the 1966 photo is from the Occoquan Reservoir, which shows it almost dry as a bone. Next slide. So a little bit more history. 4 U.S. presidents were born in the basin. George Washington, James Monroe, James Buchanan, and Woodrow Wilson. James Buchanan being the outlier there. He was born in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, but that is within the Potomac Basin. Now, the next item there is the Mount Vernon Compact. And I put that in there because it really shows the impact of the Potomac River on our nation's history. The real question was, during the Articles of Confederation, could states tax each other or erect tariffs between each other like they were sovereign states? And there was a dispute between Maryland and Virginia. And so George Washington called everybody together at Mount Vernon, and these commissioners agreed that there would be free navigation of the Potomac River and there would be no tariffs or taxation. And they thought that was a great thing, but maybe we should invite Pennsylvania in. So then they said, okay, let's get together in Annapolis and we'll invite Pennsylvania in, and a few of the other states joined in. And at the Annapolis Convention, they said, well, you know, it's really something that involves all the colonies. So let's all the states now, let's all bring us together and we'll have a convention in Philadelphia. And that led to the writing of the Constitution. So the Mount Vernon Compact could be considered to be the grandfather of the U.S. Constitution. So it has a big impact on history. Now, the C&O Canal, many of you are familiar with that, 184.5 miles from Cumberland down to Georgetown. That canal, of course, was the brainchild of George Washington, who thought that what he was really worried about was the country cleaving between east and west, not north and south, east and west, because people on the other side of the mountains would be naturally drawn going down the Ohio River and therefore be under the influence of Spain, France, and England. And so he wanted to join, to make it possible to join the western parts of the country with the eastern half. And that's why you get the C&O, which would be the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. One could also be a little cynical at that point and just say, well, George Washington owned a lot of land in the Ohio Valley and wanted to make it possible for his goods to get to market. But let's leave that aside. The idea was that this great national project would be built connecting Cumberland. They never made it to Ohio, but they made it to as far as Cumberland, and then the railroad took a lot of the business away from the C&O Canal. A lot of Civil War sites that are in the basin, John Brown's raid in West Virginia, Battle of Manassas in Virginia, Battle of Antietam in Maryland, Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Most people don't realize that Gettysburg is actually in the Potomac Basin. And then, of course, Ford's Theater with the assassination of Lincoln in D.C. Now, there was a dispute, there'll be a lot of disputes between Maryland and Virginia, and one of them concerned this place called Hog Island in the Potomac. And so the two states argued about whether or not the boundary included this Hogs Island, or whether or not the boundary would just follow the shoreline, and then Hogs Island would not be in Virginia, but in Maryland. And so they submitted it to arbitration and then came out with the Black-Jenkins Award of 1877, which awarded the island to Virginia, but it was a sort of a Pyrrhic victory because that island is not there anymore. It just sunk into the Potomac River, and this whole dispute was for naught, you know, who owned the island. But what came out of the Black-Jenkins Award was an agreement that the boundary line between the two states would not follow every little nook and cranny of the river. As you know, there are a lot of bays and there are a lot of inlets and things like that. And so they came up with the idea of going headland to headland, which is a headland is a promontory that sticks out into the river. And so if you draw the dots and you connect the dots between headland to headland, that gives you sort of a uniform boundary down the river there. And that has worked. And so what they did was they commissioned a boundary commission in 1929 to actually put these discs at these spots of these headlands, and that's one of them there. I took that picture, and that's the most northerly one, and that's in Alexandria. And it's very close to where the southernmost portion of the boundary stones of the District of Columbia. So if you find that, you'll probably also be able to find this little disc that shows the boundary from the Virginia Maryland Boundary Commission in 1929. Finally, the other thing that's on the list there, Virginia versus Maryland. Remember, up to now, I've been talking about the boundaries between the two states, but under riparian rights, you have the right to use water that passes by your property. And so the question was, did Virginia have riparian rights to use the Potomac, even though it was property of Maryland? And the Supreme Court in 2003 said, yes, Virginia, you could use the water of the Potomac. So therefore, Fairfax Water, which extended its intake into the middle of the river, was allowed to go forward, even though Maryland objected. So you have the difference between usage and ownership, and that has continued to this day. Next slide. So who are the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin? We are an interstate compact for the purpose of really regulating pollution in the Potomac. Congress was very concerned in 1940 because the Potomac was an open sewer and wanted to do something about it. And so they authorized the 5 basin jurisdictions, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and District of Columbia, to enter into a interstate compact. People probably remember from their constitution that states can't do this unless they get approval from Congress. And so Congress approved it in 1940. And then in 1970, expanded its authority to include water supply issues. And so the important point to remember there is that we have no regulatory authority. And then each of those jurisdictions, including the United States, gets to appoint 3 commissioners to the ICPRB. And so those are my boss. Now, in Virginia, the 3 commissioners are Paul Holland. Some of you may know Paul. Michael Robond, who's the head of the Department of Environmental Quality. And then Kathy Tran, who is a delegate from Fairfax, who represents the area near the Occoquan in Fairfax County. So those are the 3 Virginia commissioners to ICPRB. Next slide. So this is what we do. We put out these reports. So since we can't do any, we have no regulatory authority, and really the impressive thing is just how much is followed by the states, what we recommend. And it's really a credit to our staff. I have 7 PhDs on the staff, and the others, almost all of them have Masters of Science and things like that. So it's a very scientific organization. We have a very large library, which we moved here to downtown Rockville. It's one of the largest collections of information about the Potomac that's not online. So we're the I guess the curator of that. Next slide. So when I came on board, I asked the staff, what are our 12 big accomplishments? And they gave me this list. The first one is the improvement treatment of wastewater. That's a very important one. We put out a report saying we needed wastewater treatment on the Potomac. And lo and behold, over time, primary, secondary, and now tertiary with the Blue Plains plant really has improved the water quality in the Potomac River dramatically. We support aquatic resources. The Mather Gorge is a biodiversity hotspot on not only in the United States, but on the planet. We cooperate on improving drinking water supply, and that's through our co-op section that was created after the 1970 amendments to our charter. We assist watershed groups. We actually helped form the Anacostia Watershed Society. Um, we, we created an emergency river spill model so that we can actually, if there's a polluting event on the Potomac, we actually can calculate when that polluting event would get to the intakes along the Potomac, and we share that. We develop open source data. Unlike a lot of think tanks and private entities, we don't put proprietary protections on anything we do. We share it with everybody. We also have been a leader in the North Branch to try to convert that area, which was heavy industrial. Some of you may remember Duluth paper mill that was up there, into a more ecological and environmentally friendly tourism industry up there. We restored the American shad to the Potomac. Actually, George Washington made more money from fishing than he did from farming, but the river was overfished and the shad disappeared. In the 1990s, ICPRB spearheaded the return of the shad to the Potomac, and now the shad makes its run again, just like it did in George Washington's time. We protect drinking water sources. We have a drinking water source protection partnership. We also assess the stream biological health in what we call Chesapeake. We guide regional planning efforts, such as one on PFAS and salt, and we respond to contamination events. The picture you see on the right-hand side is a convocation of all the stakeholder and other agencies in the Potomac River to simulate a massive oil spill on the Potomac and to find out who would do what and how. It was a tabletop exercise and it stimulated this spill. Next slide. So then we have developed these plans. A 15-year plan, which is the One Basin, One Future. And we just finished our first 5-year review of that plan, and we found out we're on target, we're on track, and we tweaked it a little bit this past year. And then also our strategic plan, which is a shorter term 3-year plan. So if you think of the two documents, one is sort of outlooking our 15-year plan, and the strategic plan is more inward looking. What are we going to do here as an agency? And so that's our 3-year plan. So next slide. Well, I like to caption this slide as, where did the water go? You see that kid looking around the viewfinder, and as you look at the Great Falls of the Potomac, there's not much water there. In 1966, I visited DC with my grandparents, and I remember sitting on the edge of the bed in the hotel room watching the news, and they were talking about the drought of 1966. And I remember asking my grandmother, why are they showing a bunch of rocks? Because it was advertised as the Great Falls of the Potomac, and I couldn't see any water flowing down the Potomac at the Great Falls. It's stuck in my mind. And 1966, as you remember, September of 1966 from the chart, was the lowest flow ever recorded in the Potomac River. Now, it wasn't just the Potomac Basin, it was up and down the East Coast. I was in New York at the time, and I remember the ads on TV saying, save water today or be thirsty tomorrow. And so it was a bad drought throughout the entire East Coast. So anyway, the next slide. And the Army Corps of Engineers had been looking at the issue of water supply in the DC region, and they issued a report in 1963, 3 years before the major drought. And as you see on that chart there, the line in red is the projection from the Army Corps of Engineers about the demand for water in the DC area. And as you see, the slope of that line gives one a lot of pause because there wasn't enough water to go around. And so they came up with a plan to build 16 reservoirs in the Potomac Basin. And that plan would have flooded the C&O Canal, would have flooded Harper's Ferry, a lot of Civil War sites. It was really a lot of pushback from the region, and said, no, we don't think that's the way to go. What we think is the way to go is to give ICPRB more power to coordinate and to work with the water suppliers in a systems approach. And this was the formation of the co-op system that we have today. And that was formed as a response to the 1966 drought. And as you see on the timeline there are a couple of items to know about. We have a low flow allocation agreement, which divvies up the water if it's not enough water to go around. And we also have what's called a water supply coordination agreement, which is designed to try to prevent the low flow allocation agreement from ever being tapped. And you see, they did build a few reservoirs. They built the Jennings-Randolph Reservoir and also the Little Seneca Reservoir, which is in Black Hills Regional Park. But for Jennings-Randolph, it takes 9 days for water released from Jennings-Randolph to get down to the DC intakes. So it's really it's a backup, but it's something that we don't want to tap. Now, if you see on those curves on the right-hand side, we do projections every 5 years about water demand. And as you see what's happening there is that every time we did a projection, the slope got flatter and flatter and flatter. So it wasn't the Army Corps of Engineers 1963 projection, but rather that was way out of whack. And the reason for that was that you had the invention of low flow toilets, low flow appliances, and even though the region grew as projected by the Army Corps of Engineers, water demand was flat and has remained flat. Now, at some point, there is going to be a reckoning where all of the old technology is going to be fully retired, and so therefore you won't get this great lift by putting in low flow toilets that you've had over the past couple of years. So, and also people have been more conscious about saving water and not wasting the resource. Next slide. So what is the co-op system? 3 major suppliers: the Washington Aqueduct, WSSC Water, Fairfax Water, and I see on that map there are the service areas that the Washington Aqueduct serves Arlington.
Where's the checkbook that you wrote, Greg?
What? I'm sorry.
For Greg.
I think it's up.
So anyway, you have the Arlington and Washington, D.C. being supplied by the Washington Aqueduct, which is an arm of the Army Corps of Engineers. And then you also have WSSC Water providing water to Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and Fairfax Water providing water to Fairfax and Falls Church and other places. The important thing to remember here is that why did the Washington Aqueduct get involved? Well, in 1851, there was a fire at the Library of Congress, and there was no water to put out the fire. And the Congress said to the Army Corps of Engineers, build an aqueduct to bring water down from Great Falls so that we can put out fires in the District of Columbia. And that became the water supply system for DC. And that's the only water supply system that is run by the Army Corps of Engineers in the entire country. Now, the supplies in there, Potomac River providing 78% of all the water in the area. Off Potomac storage is about 22%. And that's these reservoirs that are shown on that map, the Potomac Reservoir and the Occoquan Reservoir. And then the upstream reservoirs are shared among the water suppliers during drought. Now, there is an operational target. We don't want the water suppliers to drink the river dry because of the aquatic resources that are necessary in the river itself and also in the Chesapeake Bay. And so there's 100 million gallon per day flow by at the Little Falls Dam that has to be maintained. And so that's one of the things we do and we look at to make sure that that flow by is being maintained by the water suppliers. Next slide. So anyway, these multi-jurisdictional regional water management, as I said before, the Water Supply Coordination Agreement in 1982 coordinates drought operations via ICPRB's co-op section and the Operations Committee, which actually meets on Tuesday of this week, the shared upstream reservoirs, and we do the forecast of water demand and availability every 5 years. The MWCOG has a drought awareness response plan. And that has been triggered now. In July, MWCOG issued a drought watch, and that is still in effect. It's first drought watch since 2010. And then the low flow allocation agreement, as I mentioned before, that gets down to brass tacks. I mean, there's not enough water to go around, and who gets what water, and that's really done through cooperative agreements to make sure that the allocation of water is done. Okay, let's see, next slide. So planning and climate adaptation is that we do these forecasts, and now ever since 2000, we have included a climate change component in our forecast. And we also try to estimate upstream water demands, consumptive use since 2005. We have a model called the Potomac Reservoir and River Simulation Model, PRISM. And we have done these studies, 2020, the water supply study, and then also the water supply alternative study in 2017 to say, okay, what are the options that are out there for increasing or making the water supply system in DC more resilient? And so we did that study in 2017. I'll get in that a little bit later on. Next slide. So these are technical tools. I won't go into that. That's PRISM on the left there. We have Oasis. And then a lot of these other operational tools that we use. Like I said, a lot of very sophisticated modeling goes on here at ICPRB. Next slide. So the two great worries are we have a spill event or a contamination event, and the second one is a crippling drought. So let's look at a likelihood of a spill event. We run this spill notification network and calculate the travel times using the emergency spill model. And there have been serious spills in the Potomac in the past. The most significant of which was the 1993 Colonial Pipeline spill. Colonial Pipeline runs from Dallas all the way up to New York City, and it crosses the Potomac. And what you see on the right-hand side there was a blowout in 1993, which poured oil into Sugarland Run, right down through Algonquian Regional Park and into the Potomac River. Now, fortunately, the river's flow and winds kept the oil on the one side of the river, the Virginia side. So it did not affect the Washington Aqueduct or the WSSC, but it did force Fairfax Water to shut down its intakes for 2 weeks, in which it relied on the Occoquan Reservoir. Probably can't do that now because of the growth in Fairfax. The Occoquan Reservoir would not be sufficient to cover that. But there have been other basin spills. We had a latex oil sheen, research facilities and spills. And then on 2021, when I was here, we had 3 spills on the same day. So that's likelihood of a spill event. And I got to say, there are 2 components there, and I don't want to stress this too much. You have accidental spills, say a rail derailment up in Harper's Ferry that puts chemicals in the drink, or it could be done deliberately because this is the seat of government, and so that it could be a contamination event that's not accidental. Let's put it that way. All right. So now the other great worry is what's the likelihood of a crippling drought? Now we have a global context. We've done a lot of modeling here. That even though the basin is projected to be wetter and hotter over time, which is good for water supply, that we think that the variability is going to increase. So the wet years are going to be wetter and the dry years are going to be drier. So overall, you may have more water in the basin, but you could have really serious droughts in the future. And that's what we're really worried about. So wetter average conditions, but wetter wet years and deeper droughts. And the basin has had significant droughts, as I mentioned, in 1930, in 1966, of course, the lowest flow ever. And in 1999 and 2002, there were 2 droughts that the co-op system was able to handle. What we think of as a worst case scenario is this climate change induced drought that persists for a very long period of time and is very, very severe. And so that's what keeps me up at night. So as you see on that chart on the right-hand side, and I think it's pretty accurate to at least this week, 3% of the basin is still in extreme drought conditions, and 74% is in moderate drought. Next slide. So this chart is something that compares the average flow of the river, adjusted daily flow at Little Falls. And it shows these banding and to show you that the river flow is highest in the spring, as you might expect, and it gets very low around September and October, and then comes back up again at the end of the year. The dark black line is our current flows for this year. And so you see what happened was it stopped raining and earlier this year. It was very, very dry June, if you remember. And so the river flow dropped significantly. And then we had Hurricane Debbie came through, or the remnants of Hurricane Debbie, and that's that first peak that's there. And then it got very dry again. And then lo and behold, Helene came through, and that was the other peak there. And now it's gotten dry again with recent like 38 days in a row where DC did not receive any precipitation. These are what I call flash droughts. You know, they just kind of come up and it just stops raining. And so we hope that we are going to return to normalcy. But what we really worry about now is that if we have dry conditions persist through the rest of the year and to the early part of the spring, then we'll be in a vulnerable situation next year if the drought condition continues. So that sort of shows how and also if it rains all at once, after it's been very dry, the ground is like concrete then, and it all rushes off. It doesn't seep into the soil, doesn't improve the soil moisture, doesn't get into the groundwater, and that's the worst of all possible worlds. You want to have a nice steady flow of water, a nice precipitation over a long period of time, not this drought and flood condition. That's the worst thing you can have. Next slide. So what's the impact of losing access to the waters of the Potomac River? We commissioned a study by two professors who were associated with GMU. They calculated that if we lost water from the Potomac River, it would cost 6.5 billion with a B in gross regional product over 2 weeks, within 2 weeks. And that's not even including the loss of tax revenues, because if people aren't going to restaurants or whatever, they're not paying taxes. And so that would be a big impact too. So then you looked at the sort of unquantifiable impact would be on the federal government, including the Pentagon, the Congress, federal agencies. They couldn't operate, and it'd be worse than COVID because the workers couldn't even go home because their homes would be without water. So, you know, what we worry about is that this triple threat here, one being you lose drinking water. Okay, well, maybe you bring in bottled water, but number two, you can't flush toilets. And number three, you need water suppression systems. And if the intakes are shut down, you lose all three, and the town could burn down. That's the worst case scenario. So I want to, if you come from this discussion with one thing, remember that Washington, D.C. and Arlington County are the most at risk of losing access to their water supply than any other city in the entire country, because both are 100% dependent on one source of water, which is the Potomac, and both only have a 1-day backup. And that's not true any place else in the country. So Washington, D.C. and Arlington are the most vulnerable cities to the loss of water. And so that's something that people don't realize because it's worked so well for so long, but there are these threats that are out there. Anyway, I think the boil water event was a sort of a wake-up call that happened over the July 4th holiday. You may have recalled that. Fortunately, the EPA then allowed Washington Aqueduct to use certain chemicals to address the harmful algal bloom, which was the source of the problem, and it was resolved. But that could have been very serious if it continued for a longer period of time. So what's the solution? The next slide. So in December 2022, Congress passed the Water Resources Development Act, which has authorized a study of ways to make the water supply of the DC area more resilient to spills and droughts. Congress appropriated $500,000 for the study, and we may get $600,000 more. It's a 50-50 cost share by the federal government. So the water suppliers and other sources will make up the difference, and the feasibility study is already underway. But it will take 3 years and cost $3 million and come up with some solutions. Once you come up with those solutions, then you have to sort of implement them. And some of the ideas that have been discussed is a reverse osmosis process, or using the water from the Blue Plains treatment plant to what's called toilet to tap, or building a big pipeline from Harper's Ferry down to the city. And then the final one is one that we have suggested, acquisition of the Travilla Quarry in Potomac, Maryland, and converting it into another reservoir for storage. That's where we are. So what are the other water resource projects we do? Next slide. We coordinate the Drinking Water Source Protection Partnership, which I guess is 38 partners now, governments and water suppliers, who are looking at ways of protecting the source waters of the Potomac, the upstream area. And one of the real great tools is a land prioritization project, which we share with land trusts and other entities to say, okay, look, if you're going to protect a piece of property, try to protect those pieces of property that are most important as for protecting the public drinking water sources. We also focused on winter salt management strategies, mainly because you can have an adverse taste in drinking water, but impact on low sodium diets, killing freshwater species, damage to infrastructure like bridges, and it's very costly to remove salt once it gets into the water. Next slide. So this is a heat map from 1940 to 2020, which we compiled on the basis of data that was received by the Washington Aqueduct over time. And so that period of time you see, the darker the color is, the more salt that's in the water. And now you can see, as you probably would expect, that during the winter months, the top part of the chart there, January, February, there's more salt because of the use of salt on roadways. But now it's sort of like throughout the entire system. And so the salt levels have risen consistently over time, even outside of the winter salt use. Next slide. A couple of our aquatic habitat projects. We're investigating the causes and impacts of harmful algal blooms, like what happened on the July 4th holiday recently. Addressing invasive aquatic species. We're trying to encourage people to eat snakehead fish and blue catfish because they're invasives in the river. And our really exciting project is trying to restore freshwater mussels to the upper Potomac River by building these eel ladders around dams 4 and 5, which were a legacy from the old C&O Canal. That's a $1.1 million project. We're very happy that that's now moving forward. Next slide. So what's the vision for the future? A swimmable Potomac, hopefully in the future. And we are really excited that Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton has been trying to get a study done of actually of allowing people to swim in the Potomac River once again. In the DC portion of the river, you can swim above Little Fall. You can swim certainly downstream, but in the DC area, there's actually a ban on swimming in the Potomac that hopefully will be taken off. And actually, one of those little things there about Lorde, remember, she actually had a concert where she said she swam in the Potomac River. That caused a big stir in the internet world. So what can you do about the future? Next slide. What can you do or address the water issues? So during the drought, use water wisely. Cut down your shower time, running full loads of dishes and laundry, turning off the faucet, whatnot. And in the long term, putting in rain barrel, planting a rain garden, replacing lawn and drought with resistant plants. And a lot of those things are championed by your two organizations. And we hope to work more closely with you and supporting what you do, and that supports what we do. And then to urge the congressional offices to address our drinking water supply vulnerabilities. Next slide. And then also use salt carefully during the winter months. We say shovel first, scatter like one small cup of coffee of salt for the entire driveway or sidewalk, and then sweep up the salt after use. So shovel, scatter, and sweep up. to eat the aquatic species such as the Chesapeake chana, which is the new name for the northern snakehead, and eat the blue catfish, and then report unusual events on the Potomac to ICPRB if you see a polluting event on the Potomac. And also to try to publicize our events, and we can publicize your events, so that we can have our walk in the woods. We do this several times a year to get people out on the river, and then invasive plant removals, cleanups on the river, and better coordination between the two organizations. So I realize it's 7:50. I've run a little long, but be happy to answer any questions.
Mike, it was awesome. You really, you really provided a great deal, and the historical background was so interesting. So thank you very, very much for taking your
Sure.
time to spend with us. It's wonderful to learn a little bit about the background and some of the issues here. One question is how you might be working at the present with a Potomac watershed roundtable that has been started, what you might be doing with them as well as with the existing soil and water conservation districts in the area.
Well, I think Renee actually took over the job of being at the Potomac Roundtable. If you remember, we had our representative on that was Curtis Dalpra for many years, and he passed away. So we keep in touch with the Potomac River Roundtable, and so they're doing great work. The soil and water conservation districts are also somebody we work with, in particular, looking at, say, the source waters above the intakes, rather than the ones below the intakes, because of the importance of the water supply.
One question has to do with whether you envision retention ponds that some areas seem to be using to capture runoff from rains in large events. And you mentioned the possibility of purchasing a quarry.
Yes.
Potomac, Maryland, as a possible example, but would there be smaller possible retention ponds that could serve in this fashion?
Yeah, I think the example I like to use is the Frederick Municipal Forest. If you've ever been up there, that was an area that was acquired by the city of Frederick, Maryland, to protect its water supply. And it's a great place to go hiking, but it also has a number of these small ponds that provide fire suppression, so that they can put out fires in the area very quickly by using these retention ponds that store water. And so I think that, yeah, there is a role for this to try to mitigate the flow of water off the land, and try to keep it on the land, and so it has time to seep into the soil, and to to prevent it from all just running away at one time.
You are, there's some interest in wanting to know how we can get a hold of Chesapeake chana and blue catfish to do our part there on the table.
So I understand that I think it's either the Western market or the Eastern market in DC does sell the fish. They're trying to get it out to more plentiful sources. We actually had a conference on invasive species where we bought both Chesapeake chana and blue catfish, and we served that to the attendees. So it was very well done. I really liked it. It's a white fish, and it tastes good when it's prepared.
I've read other good reviews, so let's hope we can find something, a market there for it. Let's see. You study drought scenarios, but how is the basin impacted if there's a big influx of water, like a hurricane that hits close to this area?
Yeah, flood mitigation is important, and our focus on drought does not mean that we ignore the other side of the ledger, which is flood. And what we have with the flood situation is there are teams that are focused on flooding events, and we participate in those discussions and those teams. From our standpoint, it is I guess a FEMA or an issue that is concerned with the infrastructure, and so we support that, but that's not our primary focus. It's got to remember that the Potomac River is a flashy river, and the reason it's flashy, some believe, is that the river is actually older than the Appalachian Mountains. The river flowed there. The mountains grew up around it, and that's why it goes east to west, while all the other major rivers on the East Coast go north and south. And what means is that underneath the river is bedrock. And so when you have a flood event, it's like a channel of concrete. The water just rushes down the river, and there's really nothing you can do about that. There are areas where you can have floodplains to slow down the flow of the water, and parks are usually used for that. So yeah, there are solutions for the flooding event, but in the last 2 years I've been here, I've been focused on drought. And we do like to have these tropical systems come through just to replenish the water table and the aquifers.
Thank you. Someone who does kayak cleanups has been surprised by how much trash are in the waterways, especially plastic bottles, and would like to know what the likelihood is of arriving at a regional agreement on bottle deposits or some kind of litter education programs that might remediate that.
Well, I will certainly support that. As I mentioned, we have no regulatory authority, and so that's a function of the local governments. I know Montgomery County has taken the lead on the bag issue, and certainly we hope that people would use tap water and not bottled water, or if they use water, they use the refilling stations to refill their personal bottles of water. So yeah, I think that's all very good to get the trash out of the system. When I was up in Baltimore, I watched the operation of their big vessel that goes out to the inner harbor that scoops up all of the stuff that winds up in the inner harbor in Baltimore. So yeah, it's a big job, but it's something that has to be done.
There's a query about whether you have studies that describe and quantify sources of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in the rivers basin.
Yes, there are the Chesapeake Bay restoration, of course, is based on this modeling of how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much sediment is in the river, and that study is those materials are available at ICPRB. We do watch that. Now, it does depend on the flow of the river. Sometimes the flow of the river could be high or it could be low, and that influences the amount of sediment, for example. But over time, we have one of those heat maps that show the phosphorus, for example, in the Potomac, which is much better now than it used to be when there was phosphorus in the detergents, for example. So that's a good thing. Nitrogen, not so much, but it is better. I mean, the Potomac Conservancy uses our data to put out their little report card every year, and it shows that the river is getting better, but not as fast as we all would want.
Mike, we probably have three more somewhat substantive questions. I don't know whether I want to honor your.
No, I can stay a little longer.
Could go a few minutes. All right. This is a question I'm not sure I fully understand, but you probably will. From Devin Reese: to increase water supply reliability for the region, could you address the role of interconnections of local water supply systems and risk-based demand reduction?
Right. Okay. First question is the interplay between all the water systems. They use different pipes, different chemicals, and so switching from one to another is not an easy proposition. And we only have to look at Flint, Michigan to see what happens when you do that. And so yes, that's one of the options that has been discussed about trying to improve the connections between the different water systems so that you could use water from one source to the other. We do that in a way because what we would do is in a drought condition, try to protect DC and Arlington, who are totally dependent on the Potomac River, and kick off WSSC from the Potomac, and ask them to use their Patuxent River reservoir. And the same thing is true with Fairfax Water, kick them off the river so that they would use be more dependent on the Occoquan. And then finally do a load shift between the Little Falls intakes and the Great Falls intakes of the Washington Aqueduct. So in the systems situation, you almost have it operating as one system anyway, but recognizing that direct connections between the two or the three entities would be problematic at this point.
Thank
There
you.
was the second question there, I forgot. What was the-
Risk-based demand reduction.
Well, yeah, I think the idea would be to try to have some sort of mechanism to impress upon people by a price mechanism to not use water during peak times and to I mean when I think of risk-based, I think of more of a pricing system to make it more expensive to use water at certain times than others. Whether or not the operators of the systems can do that, I don't know. That's an operational question.
Right. In a drought, somebody would like to know more about the flow levels. In a drought, who would issue instructions to the populace to conserve water and give specific instructions?
Right, that MWCOG, working through the PIOs, the public information officers of the water suppliers and ICPRB, would issue specific instructions to folks. Right now, our instruction is to use water wisely, and we have all those tips about water reduction or water conservation. But in a situation where it became a lot more dire, then there would be specific prohibitions, say on watering of lawns or washing your car and things like that. But fortunately, we haven't gone down that route. That's never been triggered here, and we want to try to prevent that from occurring. And hopefully, people will get the message and try to conserve water voluntarily until we get the rains.
There are some concerns about safety of eating fish taken out of the Potomac. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I've eaten fish out of the Potomac, and I'm still here to tell the tale. But I think that's an important thing to remember is that a lot of rivers on the East Coast have been exposed to toxic chemicals and pollutants. In Washington D.C. and vicinity, fortunately, it's not as heavy as in certain other river systems. Our concern has been less on, say, PCBs and more on PFAS, for example, which is something that we really don't know the effect of that. And that's something that has been a pollutant in the Potomac River because of the use of it in firefighting foam. So wherever you had an airport or a military base, for example, you had this foam being used that had PFAS in it. And that has been gradually coming down, especially they used to practice with it. And, what you could do is you could have a substitute for that didn't have PFAS in it, just to practice. So that has been one of the alternatives to it. So, yeah, I mean, we've been less concerned with, say, PCBs and other things because of the history of the Potomac River, but it's still a concern, and I would urge people be careful about that and to monitor their intake.
Mhm. And it would be a good time now to talk about the newsletter that comes out. Does it come out weekly or biweekly, Mike?
Renee, I think we're gonna be putting out one, we usually do it on Thursdays. And I think we're gonna miss a week. Is that right, Renee?
Yeah, it usually comes on Thursday, but you missed it this week.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful resource. It's a good way to learn about many. There's an aggregation of other materials that's offered in that newsletter. Renee has put she has given us a link to sign up for that newsletter. I'm happy to forward one at some point to both the Master Gardener and the Armin listservs so that people can see what it's about. But I have found it to be very interesting.
About the consumption of fish, there are limits on the amount of fish that taken from the Potomac and for personal consumption. So urge people to follow those guidelines. Some folks may eat too much of the fish from the Potomac, but at least what I've read, as long as you're within the limits that are set by the local governments, you should be okay.
All right. And finally, we will let you go. What's your favorite portion of the river, Mike?
I'm going to say Hancock. I like Hancock. It's a nice little town. It's one of these canal towns. Good restaurants, nice places to stay up there. It is also the terminus of the Western Maryland Rail Trail, as well as the C&O Canal towpath. So a lot of hiking opportunities up in Hancock. I personally would say Hancock.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Oh, well, thank you to you and to Renee. Mike is available. And as our Renee, if you have further questions. And I would also like to thank Scarlett Swan for being our hostess this evening and for helping us to mount this presentation. And thank you so much for giving us this evening.
My pleasure, and thank you both those organizations for the great work you do in protecting this national treasure. Potomac River is called the nation's river for a reason, and we all have an obligation to make it as pure and ample as possible.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just like to add that in addition to, since you're federally funded, there are these advocacy groups like the Anacostia River Keepers, the Potomac Conservancy, Potomac River Keeper, and it's certainly possible to give them your support and participate in their activities.
Well, we actually are supported by the signatory jurisdictions, and this year, but we're supposed to get from federal government, but we haven't gotten it since 2009, except for this year, thanks to Congressman Raskin. He was able to get us our federal appropriation this year.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Well, your many accolades in the chat box talking about this superb talk, and much appreciation, Mike.
No, thank you very much for inviting us.
Okay. All right. Well, good night, all.
Good night.